Good morning. I'm Ida Domersnes, and I'm stepping in for Kristin Sandvik today, so bear with me. On behalf of PRIO, I welcome you to today's seminar, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Andrew Feinstein, the author of The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade. Andrew served as an ANC Member of Parliament in South Africa for over 7 years. He resigned in 2001 in protest at the ANC's refusal to allow an independent inquiry into the multi-billion-dollar arms deal, which was tainted by allegations of high-level corruption. He described the deal, the corruption and its cover-up in his political memoir, the best-selling first book, After the Party, A Personal and Political Journey Inside the ANC. Besides being an author and a journalist, Andrew is, amongst many other achievements, the founding director of Corruption Watch. He also works with anti-corruption investigators and prosecutors around the world. Andrew's book, The Shadow World, details corruption, criminality, and the destruction found in the global arms market. With an exceptional access to sources and information normally labeled strictly private and confidential, it describes the complex web of illicit and licit networks and the interlinkages between them. In the book, he unveils the shadow of the world of cover-ups and corruption behind some of the world's largest arms deals and revolving doors relationships, and how this undermines accountable democracy, human rights, and socio-economic development. The title of today's seminar is What's Wrong with the Arms Trade and What to Do About It. Personally, I'm intrigued by the last part. Knowing the unique treatment the arms industry receives from governments, what can be done about it, I wonder. But first, Andrew will address how global arms trade impact democracy, development, and security. His address will be followed by introduction by Øystein Rolandsen and Marsh, whom I will introduce afterwards. On that note, take it away, Andrew.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much to Nick, to PRIO, for organizing this seminar at very short notice. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks to the Human Rights, Human Wrongs Film Festival, where I'm speaking tomorrow at 3 o'clock, together with a showing of a film about the arms trade, particularly in Norway. I must start with 2 apologies, though. The first is that I have terrible flu, so I might have to, during my presentation, just stop to blow my nose. And the second is just to say that I have a terrible habit when I speak of wandering around, which is probably a consequence of being of limited height and having spent quite a lot of time in politics. Because when we were first elected in 1994, in South Africa's first democratic elections, a few weeks after the election, I was sent with one of our provincial premiers to Atlanta. Oh, you know what? I haven't switched it on. That's fine. Right. Is that better? Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Shall I give that back to you? So I was sent to Atlanta, Georgia, with one of our provincial premiers. This was the first trip by an ANC delegation to the US after the elections. And they were very excited to have us there. And as you probably know, Atlanta is home to CNN and to the Coca-Cola Corporation. So we arrived there and we were welcomed by the mayor. What was his first name? I can't remember. Mayor Bradley was his name. And to me, he seemed about 7'8". He was a former professional basketball player. And he welcomed us from behind a lectern that was an illuminated Coke can. So after he'd welcomed us, the premier I was traveling with said to me, Andrew, won't you just go and thank him? I'm too tired after our flight. So I walked up behind this Coke can, and I said a few words, and I walked back down, and I said to the guy I was with, was that okay? And he said, the speech was fine. It's a pity that all we could see was the top of a very shiny bald head sticking out of a Coke can. And since then, I just have this sort of aversion to standing behind lecterns or sitting when I speak. Just very briefly, in the time that I have, and I must be cognizant of time, I'm going to just touch on a few things that perhaps we could deal with more in Q&A afterwards, so you can decide where you would like to focus or ask me more questions. Because on a topic like this, in 20 minutes or so, it's impossible to give any sort of comprehensive overview. But let me just give you a few points about it. In 2010, global military expenditure is estimated to have totaled $1.6 trillion. That's $235 for every person on the planet. Today, the United States spends almost $1 trillion a year, just the US, on national security. With a 2010 defense budget under President Obama of over $703 billion. Interestingly, the trade in conventional arms, both big and small, varies between about $50 billion a year all the way up to about $150 billion a year, depending on what sort of transactions are taking place. And it is my contention that this expenditure has profound impacts on the world in which we live, from the enabling, fueling, and perpetuation of conflict, to the corrosion of democracy in both buying and selling countries, and the massive opportunity costs in terms of socioeconomic development in countries of the South, but also, I would argue, the prosperity and well-being of ordinary taxpayers in more advanced economies. When I first started this research, and I came to it unintentionally as a member of parliament, my responsibility in South Africa was primarily the building of a public sector financial management framework. So my committee drafted the legislation according to which public monies were spent and how that public money would be accounted for post-spending. And I came to this only because there was a massive deal that I'll talk about very briefly that has had huge impacts, both on public finances, but I would argue on South Africa's democracy as a whole. And when I started researching this book, I thought that I would do it as two separate narratives of the so-called formal trade, the government-to-government trade, and the illicit or black market trade. And as I researched and started writing, I realized that the two are so closely intertwined that it would actually be impossible to separate the narratives in that sort of way. And that came as something of a surprise to me. So arms deals stretch across a vast continuum of legality and ethics, from the official, the formal trade, all the way to the black market. And in between, one finds gray transactions or the gray markets in arms deals, which I suppose the most obvious examples would be where governments use arms deals that are partly legitimate, partly illegal, to influence foreign policy in covert ways. But the reality is that in practice, the boundaries between these three markets are extremely fuzzy. With bribery and corruption commonplace, I would argue, throughout the piece, there are very few arms transactions that do not involve illegality, most often through middlemen or agents. And it's astonished me how many arms dealers who provide services to the large defense companies, in the States called defense contractors, and to governments, continue to operate in the black and gray markets. In a quite remarkable piece of work, based on the collation of information and evidence from amongst the biggest national treasuries in the world and some of the most powerful intelligence agencies in the world, Joe Robo, working with Transparency International at the time, calculated that the trade in weapons accounts for almost 40% of all corruption in all world trade. So an industry that is worth between $50 and $150 billion a year in terms of the formal trade, accounting for 40% of all corruption, gives you just some indication of the extent of corruption in those deals. And why is this the case? Why is the arms trade so susceptible to corruption? To put it very simply, and here again I'm talking about the formal trade, you have contracts worth tens of billions of dollars, and you probably only have 4 to 6 of these major contracts every year. They're decided on by a very, very small number of people. In the South African deal, there were 5 people who made all of the final decisions about what to purchase and from whom. And all of this takes place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. So it really is the perfect recipe for corruption. So much money is at stake that the companies are prepared to pay major bribes. So few people need to be bribed to turn a decision. And the level of public scrutiny is often virtually non-existent. So in South Africa, in late 1998, early 1999, we decided to spend what will ultimately amount to almost $10 billion on weapons that we didn't need and that we barely use today. $300 million of bribes were paid on those contracts to middlemen, senior politicians, including the defense minister at the time, his political advisor, the head of procurement in the South African National Defense Force, a number of the senior executives of the state arms company, all of whom now live in Australia, and sadly, to my own political party, to the ANC itself. When I was re-elected in the 1999 election, little did I know that that campaign was fought on the proceeds of the bribes from the arms deal. Some of the contracts were simply absurd. The Air Force decided that it needed a new jet fighter and trainer. 9 companies bid for the contract. 2 were shortlisted, excluding a joint bid by Britain and Sweden, BAE Systems and Saab. They didn't make the shortlist because of a whole lot of technical factors and the fact that they were 2.5 times more expensive than the jet that the Air Force actually wanted. The Minister of Defense insisted, when the shortlist came to him, that it be returned to the technical committee and that BAE and Saab be put onto the list. When they were 3rd out of 3. He then decided on the single largest contract entered into by the democratic South Africa until today, 18 years after our democracy. He decided to exclude cost as a procurement criteria. They were still only in 2nd place. So he then changed the weighting of the value of the economic and industrial offsets and gave BAE and Saab the opportunity to increase their offset offer, an opportunity that was not given to the 2 other countries, and that put them into 1st place. The head of the Air Force said publicly at the time they would only accept these jets if forced to do so by the politicians, and that's exactly what happened. To date, 12 of the 26 jet fighters have ever been airborne, so the majority of them have never left the ground because South Africa doesn't need them, can't afford the fuel to fly them, and can't afford to train the pilots to fly them. They are a profound waste of money. Of the 24 trainer jets purchased, 11 have ever been in the air for similar reasons. And we decided to spend this money at the time when then President Thabo Mbeki was informing us in the ANC caucus that we could not afford to provide antiretroviral medication to the over 5 million South Africans then living with HIV and AIDS. According to a study by the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, in the 5 years after the arms deal was signed, 365,000 South Africans died avoidable deaths because their government couldn't afford to provide them with the medication that could save their lives. The investigations into that deal went the way of investigations into most corrupt arms deals. The Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom. The investigation in South Africa was neutered, I should tell you. And I was given the choice by the president of continuing my committee's investigation, which I'd initiated without ANC support, or ending my political career. The leaders of the ANC were prepared to undermine the very institutions of our democracy that many of them had fought courageously for decades to bring about in order to ensure that corruption in this deal was not revealed. Parliament was undermined, prosecutorial authorities were undermined, the intelligence agencies, the two major anti-corruption bodies in the country were disbanded because of their zeal to investigate this matter. The Serious Fraud Office was investigating 6 major corrupt deals undertaken by BAE Systems. The most important of those, the biggest arms deal ever concluded and perhaps the most corrupt transaction in trading history, the so-called Al-Yamamah deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, in which £6 billion of commissions were paid, including almost £1.5 billion to the then Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar bin Sultan. Mark Thatcher, son of Britain's Prime Minister at the time of the deal, received £12 million as an agent on the deal. Last year, having the year before, not the year before, a couple of years before that, been stopped by the direct intervention from then Prime Minister Tony Blair from continuing an investigation into Al-Yamamah, the Serious Fraud Office decided to settle with BAE Systems on the 5 other corrupt deals, including the South African deal. The company was fined £500,000, and the SFO undertook that for 10 years it would not investigate corruption against the company and would not allege corruption by BAE in any third-party investigations. I could regale you for hours with similar examples of deals just like the South African deal, with investigations that also went nowhere. I've been involved in a whole lot of them. I could talk also for hours about the US system of procurement, in which a circle of patronage between the Pentagon, where in 2010, 84% of senior officials and generals retiring from the Pentagon went into senior executive positions with the very defense contractors whom they'd been giving contracts to throughout their careers. Weapons projects are then approved by lawmakers in Congress who, until the financial services sector took over from it, received more campaign contributions from defense contractors than any other sector of the economy, are promised jobs by those same defense contractors, so that on the big weapons projects like the F-35, they claim to place jobs in every single congressional district. And woe betide the member of Congress who votes against the weapons project. They are then met with a lobbying effort in their home district claiming that they are voting against jobs for their own constituents. In the last midterm elections, the 3 representatives who had opposed the F-35 project all lost their seats in the face of massive campaigns from defense contractors and their lobbyists. And it is because of the circle of patronage that projects like the F-35 see the light of day. This is a jet fighter that the Pentagon claims will cost $382 billion at a time of economic difficulty in the US and elsewhere. The reality is that it'll probably cost closer to $1 trillion when it is finally produced. The F-35 was described to me by a Pentagon aerospace engineer who was involved in the early drafts as a complete waste of money. A jet that might have been quite good if the US was still fighting the Cold War, but is irrelevant to the sorts of conflicts that it is engaged in today. And after, in November last year, 13 major structural faults in the test planes caused test flights to be halted on the plane, he emailed me to say, the only people who are going to be in danger from the F-35 are the test pilots who are forced to fly it. It's an absurdity that I believe the Norwegian government has decided to buy. Then there are the stories of the agents, the middlemen, the dealers, who work for governments, who work for the defense contractors, and are involved in some of the worst illegal deals around the world. Be it Victor Boot, who is now in jail in New York, who, while there was an Interpol warrant out for his arrest, between 2003 and 2005, he flew weapons, equipment, and supplies into Baghdad for the United States Department of Defense and US defense contractors, making, by one calculation, $60 million in that period. A few years later, they decided to arrest him in a sting operation because they discovered he was still arming insurgents in Iraq and Afghanistan. Or Joe de Hovsepian, a Lebanese Armenian arms dealer who had never been interviewed, who I had read about in a footnote to a commission of inquiry, was described in the footnote as the most dangerous man alive. I couldn't find this guy anywhere, so eventually I was telling my sister and her family in Cape Town about this guy I was searching for, and my then 14-year-old niece said to me, well, why don't you look for him on Facebook? And to be honest, this is going back a few years, I'd never used Facebook. So she showed me how to use it, and of course there we found Joe de Hovsepian in a big Stetson hat in his late 70s. I emailed him, and he responded along the lines of, in my long life, I've never done anything for nothing. Why should I start now? So I just sent him emails for months and months and months. Every time I met somebody, I'd send him an email saying, so-and-so says you know more about the global arms trade than anyone else alive. And eventually the flattery worked, and I got a call in London saying, I'm going to be in my office in Amman, Jordan on Sunday, why don't you come and have a chat? And he spoke to me for hours and hours and hours about his 40 years in the illicit industry, in which he'd broken pretty much every UN arms embargo there'd been, because as he told me, that's where you make the biggest money. It started off with a group of former senior Nazi officers in Germany, supported by the CIA and German intelligence, a company called Merex. That's how he got his start in the industry. I could tell you far more about him, but let me just say the following. At the end of our interview, after he'd told me that the US was the biggest terrorist threat to the planet, but he was wearing a Stetson even inside his office, and when he drove me back to my hotel, he even wore his Stetson while driving. He then pulled out his contractor ID for the US Department of Defense in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then pulled out his ID for his status as a contractor to USAID in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Liberia. There are 502 recorded violations of UN arms embargoes. Joe was probably involved in quite a lot of those. 2 of them have ever led to legal proceedings. 1 resulted in an acquittal. The other, last year, interestingly, resulted in the first ever prosecution. I could also talk about the blowback that is implicit in the global arms trade. And we need look no further than the Arab Spring, Libya and Egypt, where in the case of Libya, NATO member countries sold Gaddafi more weaponry than he could use. When the bombing raids in support of the rebels started, the first thing they had to do was destroy some of the weaponry that they had sold to him. Now we have the problem of the stockpiled weaponry that has appeared in black markets all over the world. Or the extraordinary situation in Greece at the moment, where an economic advisor to the government in Greece informed me that they were told that they have to cut across the board everything. So that some hospitals in Greece today are struggling to have the most basic supplies. But they were told by the Americans, the French, and the Germans that they could not cut 1 penny of their defense spending. So what to do? The way in which the market works, as I understand it, is that we regulate those activities that can create distortions in the market, that can create danger. Drugs, alcohol, food. The trade in weapons is less regulated than the trade in bananas. We have an opportunity through the International Arms Trade Treaty to massively increase regulation of this sector. And it's not that difficult to do. If there was a clause dealing with corruption in the Arms Trade Treaty, simply by demanding that the use of middlemen and agents is made more transparent, we would be able to probably halve the amount of corruption in the global trade in arms overnight. But to do so requires political will. And that's what we're lacking. In conclusion, let me say that if we accept the current status quo in the way in which weapons are produced and bought and sold around the world, the trade in arms will continue to make the world a poorer place, a less democratic place, a more corrupt place, and perhaps most ironic of all, a more dangerous place. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Our next speaker is Øystein Rolandsen. Øystein is a senior researcher here at PRIO. He's a historian and wrote his PhD on the political process, social groups, and conflict intensity in the southern Sudan. Øystein has followed the development in the region for over a decade and is a specialist on security, governance, and development in the and development issues in Sudan and the Horn of Africa. He has just started a 4-year research project on the history of warfare and peace building in South Sudan. Øystein will comment on the effects of arms proliferation on Sudan and the Horn of Africa.
Okay, thank you. I think I will also try to do one of these standing up lectures, but I will try to avoid walking around too much, as I saw that Andrew was quite capable of standing still. And I also have to make a small excuse that I'm also under the influence of some kind of winter sickness. But instead of blowing my nose, I might have to cough a little bit. So please excuse that. Thank you to PRIO for giving me the opportunity to comment on Andrew's intriguing book, and also for this very interesting presentation. But I think, as Ida said, I'm going to focus more on the issue of arms in Africa, and not so much on the question of the corruption inside the arms trade. And I'm specifically interested in taking this one step further. Once the African states receive these weapons from a range of corrupt dealers and various countries, what are they doing with them? I also see that a significant share of your book is dedicated to how weapons are a kind of a part, of course, a big part of the conflicts in Africa. It seems like this is the arms trade on this continent is indeed a world of exotic characters and shady deals. The book provides a very convincing and disturbing picture of actors within this shadow world. You show us how arms originating in the US, in Europe, in Russia, in China, and a number of other countries find their way into conflicts and organized violence in Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, and the Horn of Africa, as well as their role in the still unfolding Arab Spring in North Africa. The text inspired me to reflect on a number of related issues and since I'm no arms trade expert myself, I hope that you will assist me in reflecting on some wider implications from the book with regards to arms in African conflicts. I would like to emphasize in my talk now the role of African states and state leaders in channeling arms into conflict zones as a part of their domestic and foreign policy. Although you don't make this point explicitly in the book, the information provided suggests that more than international arms dealers, it is the African states that are directly linked to the supply of arms to all sides in African conflicts. True, the arms dealers and the countries selling arms on a large scale provide African states with weapons, but it appears to me then that it is the African governments and the leaders that are the main channel for these weapons going into the African conflict. So in your book, you include the conflicts of Darfur and South Sudan, and they illustrate this point clearly. I have for a number of years now mapped the Sudanese rebels obtaining weaponry and how conflict areas in Sudan and South Sudan became awash in arms. The Sudan state has, since independence in 1956, bought considerable quantities of arms from the West and from the Soviet Union, and later Russia, and more recently China has become a major supplier. But let us then consider the case of the rebel group Sudan People's Liberation Movement Army, the SPLM-A, in South Sudan. As far as I am aware, their suppliers were nearly exclusively African governments, and it was probably the Sudanese state that involuntarily provided most of the weapons. The SPLM-A captured a large share of their arms from government army stockpiles and armories. And another source was also the turncoat militias, which got weapons from the government in Khartoum and then shifted allegiance to the rebels. There were also neighboring countries and other African countries further afield that provided not only arms but training and sanctuary for the rebels. Both the Sudan government army and the SPLM-A has also leaked voluntarily or involuntarily a massive amount of guns to the general population, which they use for protection, for hunting, and for attacking other civilians, as we have seen recently. Darfur followed much of the same pattern, where weapons to the rebel came from the Sudanese state again, from Chad, Libya, Eritrea, and possibly, although this has not been proved definitely, also possibly at one stage from the SPLA. And similar analysis can be made of previous and ongoing civil wars in both Ethiopia and Uganda. And one of the examples in your book is that the civil war and the rebel group UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi. Also in this case, we see an active involvement of African states. The South African government and armed UNITA and fought alongside them. The Congolese dictator Mobutu Sese Seko facilitated for a period UNITA leaders' arms purchases with false end-user certificates. This tendency of African states to arm voluntarily or involuntarily both rebels and semi-autonomous militias as well as elements of the civilian population must have some implications for the analysis of arms trade. Firstly, why do African states give away or sell arms as a part of their foreign and domestic policy? It seems that we must search for answer to this question in the nature of African politics, as it has emerged since the 1960s. African countries seldom resort to direct military confrontation to solve interstate conflicts. Instead, they stoke each other's dissenters and buttressing them with weapons. Domestically, violence is used frequently to suppress dissent, and opposition groups tend to see the use of arms and terror as the only effective means of protest, although Egypt and Tunisia are interesting examples to the contrary. The lack of democratic checks means that it is difficult for opposition parties and the civil society to hinder African governments' the African government's instrumentalization and politicizations of arms supplies. Then to my second question. If we agree that we will for the foreseeable future have a global arms trade and military industry, what can be done beyond the existing rules and regulations to hinder that African states use arm deliveries as a part of their domestic and foreign policy. And it seems like Andrew has some good answers here, so I would very much hope that he can elaborate on some of this in his comments to my comments, hopefully. But one thing that really struck me with your book was the multitude of agents involved in arms trade in Africa and their knack for subterfuge and for circumventing embargoes and regulations. You mentioned the example of the government in Khartoum's access to the arms market despite an international embargo. And linking up to what I said about the first question, to me it seems that the long-term solution to this problem is significant socio-political changes on the continent. As long as the majority of African countries remain weak, poor, and undemocratic, it is almost impossible to alter this pattern of using arms as a part of their foreign policy. But on the other hand, as your book amply demonstrates, the level of hypocrisy in the Western world towards African states is perhaps nowhere higher than when it comes to the issue of politicized arms trade. Take, for instance, this example of the South Sudan recent tank purchases. More than 50 Soviet T-72 tanks were acquired by South Sudan between 2005 and 2011, which was an interim peace period when South Sudan was still a part of Sudan. There was some kind of uncertainty to whether they were allowed to buy arms or not under this comprehensive peace agreement. But in the case of buying these tanks, it was the Kenyan government that bought them with the knowledge and consent of the US State Department. This was then smuggled into South Sudan. It was only when a shipment was held up by Somali pirates that this turned into a large political scandal, and then suddenly the US government officially condemned Kenya's arming of the South Sudan. But even with all this international attention, it is probable that also this shipment found its way into South Sudan. So I end up with a rather pessimistic view on the possibility of controlling the flow of arms into African conflict through African states. But as I said, I hope you may help me to see new opportunities and approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Øystein. Our last speaker is Nicholas Marsh. Nick is a research fellow here at PRIO and has worked on the small arms trade since 2001. He runs NISAT, which is an online database of small arms transfers and an extensive archive of documents on small arms and armed violence. In addition, he also carries out research on the relationship between weapons, violence, and conflict. His most recent publication is an edited volume called Small Arms, Crime and Conflict, which is a perfect backdrop to his introduction today, Steps to Reform the Arms Trade.
Thank you very much, Ida, for that introduction. And also thank you very much, Andrew, for coming here, and Magnus for inviting Andrew to Norway. I'd like to basically make this presentation lead off from where Andrew's book finishes. His last chapter he briefly talks about the potential to actually reform the trade to try to reduce some of the many egregious examples that he mentions. So I'd like to here give agenda is probably too strong a word, but a list of steps that hopefully could be done over the long term to try to address Øystein's question as well.
Yeah.
So, I recently turned 40 a few months ago, which actuarially speaking is about halfway through my life. So what I wanted to do is try and think about, okay, in the next 40 years, what can we realistically hope to achieve? And then I have to try and get over my usual stance of jaded cynicism, which is
some of the others in the panel.
as you become very jaded and very cynical when you spend every single day of your working life looking at arms transfers, and especially looking at the effects of them in terms of massacres and atrocities and bribery and corruption. I'd also like to say now and stress that what I'll be doing is looking beyond an arms trade treaty. So please, anybody who's been following the negotiations towards a treaty, I'm fully aware that what I'm suggesting, in quite a lot of it, there's no chance that it would get into anything that's going to be discussed in New York in July. But as I say, I'm also trying to be fairly realistic. So by the end of my talk, if half of you say you're being ridiculously idealistic and that'll never happen, and the other half tell me I'm being far too conservative, maybe I'll have got it about right. So there's some causes for optimism. Certainly I think we can see, especially if we're looking at issues such as armed conflict or human rights, some tightening of regulations and improvements in transparency over the last 2 decades, since the end of the Cold War. Both the most high-profile example is in Europe with the EU Code of Conduct and then Common Position, but you also have numerous international agreements, especially on small arms, and regional agreements. So there's been a lot of activity. The world hasn't stood still. We have Japan as a kind of example. In 1976, the government declared that its commitment to peace, which is found in its constitution, was incompatible with it being an exporter of arms. So it had an almost complete withdrawal from the arms trade. It's not totally complete. They exported things like transport aircraft or transport ships, but Japan, since 1976, pretty much didn't export any major military equipment. They've recently talked about reforming the legislation, so we'll have to see about the future. But this is an example of a country which basically turned its back on the arms trade, and it doesn't seem, that decision alone doesn't seem to have done Japan an awful lot of harm. You had President Carter introduced a much more restrictive arms export policy in the US in 1977, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. And above all, you have continuing interest and attention on the issue. And that's highlighted by all the people who've come here today, by Andrew's book. And basically, the problem isn't going to go away. For some issues, governments could sometimes reasonably assume that, well, if we do nothing, the problem will just go away and everyone will forget about it. I mean, that isn't going to happen with the arms trade. People have been writing books such as Andrew's for, well over 100 years now. Also, economically, the arms trade isn't that important. If we look at CIPRI's figures for the trade in major conventional weapons plus trade in finished military small arms and light weapons, we get to about 26 billion. If you're wondering the difference between that and what Andrew was talking about, I assume Andrew's figures were including things like ammunition, spare parts, technology, etc. But if you just look at the finished weapons, that's about 26 billion. World trade, 15 trillion. Now there's 2 letters, the B in billion and the T in trillion, are enormously significant. So 15 trillion, that's 15,000 million. Big industries like oil and fuels, 2.3 trillion, electrical goods, 2 trillion, so that's an awful lot of iPads. So the trade in finished weapons, if you're just looking at that, about 0.17% of global trade. The 26 billion, roughly equivalent to the trade in knitted or crocheted fabric. So, and the knitted and crocheted fabric industry doesn't have the government attention that the arms trade does. So certainly, Andrew's absolutely correct when he's talking about large numbers in terms of military spending, etc. But the actual trade in finished weapons isn't so large. And therefore, and Andrew highlights this in his book very much, when you're looking at the attention that governments give to the trade, this isn't really explained by its economic value. It's explained by the use of the arms trade as a tool in foreign policy and domestic military policy, domestic security policy, etc. So, we'll talk about some first steps. I mean, these steps that should be carrying out, we should be carrying out now in 2012, and arguably should have been carried out over the last 20 years as well. So implement. all the existing treaties, laws, regulations, etc. that we have on the arms trade. There are quite a lot of them. We don't have a legally binding treaty, but we have large numbers of politically binding global agreements. We have large numbers of regional treaties, sometimes legally binding, sometimes not. Big problem is a lot of them aren't being implemented, or they're being implemented by a small number of the usual suspects. Affluent, developed Western European countries are very good at implementing some things. Although then, even then, as Andrew was saying, in terms of implementing commitments concerning outlawing bribery and corruption, they're pretty tardy. But when we, again, look across the world, especially in developing countries, they have extreme difficulties in actually implementing things. If you look at countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's pretty much impossible for it even to control its borders. It has basically no capacity to monitor its airspace. So if somebody flies an aircraft over the country, into the country, national government has no way of knowing that's happening. They don't even have the radar systems to do that. So there's an enormous amount of work that can be done in just bringing countries up to standard. And as an answer to Øystein, there wouldn't be these shady transfers. There wouldn't be the use of arms in terms of supplying proxies if the governments were able to control their borders, and also if their neighbors actually followed their neighbors' laws and regulations, followed international commitments. It's not actually legal to send arms to a rebel group in your neighbor's country. So first step, just implement the rules we have, put a lot of effort into paying for countries to improve their infrastructure, and also certainly strongly criticize, ostracize, etc., countries that are deliberately flouting regulations. Second thing, agree on an arms trade treaty. It's somewhat difficult to go further because at this stage the negotiations are going to be in July. We really don't know what the final text will be. But if we're going to step forward into 2041, well, I'm an old man, it's very difficult for that position to imagine real global progress if there isn't some kind of global legally binding agreement. It may happen, but certainly that seems to me to be sort of the vital first step. And this, the last one, I mean, the call with an arms trade treaty is to have strong, meaningful international laws regarding sales of arms to areas involved in conflict, where there's human rights abuses, etc. And there's lots of criteria which have been called for. Again, we don't know whether these are going to actually be included in a treaty text. So if they're not, that, I guess, would be a second step. It's somewhat difficult to know where to put these procedurally, but these clearly are required. And certainly another grounds for optimism is that the very campaign for an arms trade treaty, I've certainly witnessed a change in the attitude of both governments, international lawyers, etc. When we started off a bit less than 10 years ago, it was very common to hear from Western European governments, people involved in export control, from international lawyers that, well, come on, an exporter has no responsibilities at all once the arms have left its jurisdiction. That was a very common point of view. Now, that argument's pretty much been won, that pretty much everyone accepts that an exporter has some responsibility concerning what is done with the arms that they've exported. The extent of those responsibilities and what they include is certainly a matter of a lot of debate, but I think the principle that they have a responsibility at all has been established. So the next section is pretty much what I can suggest for the next few decades. What can be done after the arms trade treaty? As I said, although it's difficult to know exactly what would be in it. First, complete transparency. It is still very difficult to know exactly what is being sold and for how much. Up in the database here, we've got about 1 million records of small arms and light weapons transfers. We've got about 30,000 documents kind of archived online. You'd think that with all that information, I'd have a good idea of, say, arms that are being imported by Zimbabwe or Sudan, etc. Actually, it can be extremely sketchy in the most important areas. I can tell you an awful lot about hunting rifles being purchased by the United States, for example, but if you're looking at Kalashnikovs or RPGs or tanks going into areas of conflict, it is extremely difficult to actually work out what has been sent, how much, and the issue for corruption is that it is almost impossible to work out how much a government has paid for a single weapon. This is because A, the weapons are procured in fairly complex packages, so you don't know, well, if they're buying a whole series of equipment, you don't know how much was paid for each individual. But very often you don't have information on both the quantity of arms and the price that's paid for them. And that kind of environment where nobody really knows how much things cost is an environment in which corruption can flourish. I mean, to give you an example, we've been scratching our heads for years trying to work out unit prices for man-portable missiles. You know, how much does a man-pad cost, or an anti-tank missile? It's incredibly difficult. I mean, partly because when you do have published information on the value of contracts, there are sometimes enormous differences. So it appears that some governments are paying vastly more for weapons than other governments. So actually trying to work out how much does this cost is very difficult. So if we want to get at both the corruption angle, get at both the problems to do with the effects of arms transfers, let's get every government to release a telephone book quantities of information. Now, the US actually does that concerning procurement. I've got my colleague Matt Schroeder, the Federation of Scientists in the US. I mean, he has stacks of data that large. His problem is finding the time to actually go through it. So, I mean, it can be done. Incidentally, a lot of our unit price data actually comes from the US procurement documentation because they're the only people who actually provide that. So that information should cover everything: imports, exports, licenses for import, dealing, brokering, etc. So then governments have to actually account for what they're doing. And as to follow on from Øystein, the importation of arms is just as important in terms of information as the export. If we have exporters who aren't telling us something, that isn't a problem if the importers declare this. And that's one area where I can try and encourage any African states to improve. An area which it would be relatively easy to do so is actually to regularly and reliably report on their imports. Then I'll move on to President Carter's policy. I'm mentioning this because two reasons. First, he actually had some quite good ideas. Obviously, we can talk later about the extent that they were implemented. Yeah. But his proposals in 1977 were at the time quite radical, and it still looked quite radical. Also, this was President Carter, President of the USA, so what I'm presenting here really can't be dismissed as wide-eyed hippie idealism. It was actually tried in the world's largest arms exporter. So, he says in 1977, because of the threat to world peace embodied in the spiraling arms traffic, the US must take steps to restrain its arms transfers. A completely different form of rhetoric to what you find through the 80s, 90s, 2000s, in which the government is talking about maximizing commercial opportunity through arms exports. Obviously, with paying lip service to only supplying to certain states. So the United States will henceforth use arms transfers as an exceptional foreign policy instrument. Exceptional as in not routine. And the burden of persuasion will be on those who favor a particular arms sale rather than those who oppose it. And I think those words at the end kind of are key to reforming the trade. If you have, at the moment, the burden is basically on an opposition to a sale. If you look at information provided by governments, some of them will give you information on the arms deals, the arms license applications they've refused, and sometimes you get information on why they refused it. Pretty much no one at all will actually try to justify an existing sale, unless you have a large amount of media attention, unless the minister has to stand up and explain it. So shifting the onus from saying, okay, we'll agree upon anything unless it meets certain criteria that we'll ban, to saying, okay, let's not export arms at all unless there's a very good reason to do so, I think is the most important thing. Jimmy Carter's policies went on. These applied to countries outside NATO and Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, I should mention. He's saying reduce the dollar value of military aid. They wouldn't be the first supplier to introduce newly developed advanced weapon systems into a region. So they're deliberately avoiding trying to create a market by which I sell arms to Øystein, and then Ida decides that, well, I have to get more arms to counter the ones you just sold to Øystein. Export versions of advanced US equipment were prohibited. So what you what happens now is you have a government procures a piece of equipment from a company. Then the company makes a version of that specifically for export, specifically for foreign customers. So, just ban those. Co-production agreements for significant weapons equipment were tightly restricted or prohibited, and with no export to third parties. So again, instead of going all out and trying to have as many co-production agreements as possible, very heavily restrict them or prohibit them, and especially if you have a co-production with a third country, that third country isn't allowed to export any of the equipment. Retransfer of US origin equipment was prohibited, or again, very heavily restricted. So again, if one of the biggest problems we see in terms of arms going into conflict areas, and also with corruption, is governments selling off surplus military equipment. So if a government buys, say, new systems, or it has ammunition that's aging, it sells it off. It sells it off often to irresponsible dealers or brokers, and it's this sale of surplus equipment which is the cause of a great many of the problems that we see. And also going back to the economic arguments, the sale of surplus equipment doesn't generate any jobs in manufacturing or etc. So Jimmy Carter was saying, right, let's prohibit it. They tightly regulated US dealers and brokers. This is one area in which the world really has been extremely tardy. Back in the late 90s, we had meetings in Oslo in which people identified regulation of brokers as being one of the most important areas. There have been numerous regional agreements on brokering, UN guidelines, etc. And the number of countries which have actually introduced brokering legislation has been increasing, but at a snail's pace. Embassies and military representatives abroad would not promote the sale of arms. Again, this goes at the key of what Andrew was saying, as the trade being used as a foreign policy tool. So, ban that. I'd say they did allow the State Department officials to be involved in arms trade, but only at a very senior level. So again, somebody very high up had to make a decision that this was of sufficient importance. So again, the presumption is that you won't do it unless there's a very good reason for doing so. And he also expressed concern for promotion of human rights, economic development, in addition to promoting peace. Now again, we can, obviously we know from history, Carter's policies, his declarations certainly didn't survive the Reagan administration, and there's questions over to the extent to which they were implemented in his time. But certainly those ideas, I think, would make an awful lot of difference to reforming the trade. And as I said, it's They were actually the US's stated policy way back then. So how do we get to those kind of steps? How do we get in 1991? Everyone went, hang on, how on earth did Saddam Hussein manage to acquire all those weapons? He'd gone around everybody and bought weapons from pretty much all the suppliers. So then you had a big scandal as well with the various Western governments that had supplied him with military equipment, and you had lots of governments then implementing policy responses to stop what was called then excessive and destabilizing accumulations of weapons. But I think for that advocacy to be much stronger, to continue, very important thing is need financially secure and independent civil society organizations. Financially secure in that monitoring these things, lobbying governments is quite a technical task at times. You need to be able to build up the competence and keep somebody in there. Independent. The fact is at the moment, if you look at publications or output or employment, the vast majority of work on the arms trade, upon the effects of armed violence, is being funded by governments. And there's a very small number of organizations which are independent of governments, Amnesty International being the most prominent. There's a campaign against the arms trade, etc. as well. Now, this poses a problem. First, while the government funding, and I have to say, this is where we get our funding from as well, so we're part of that system. Governments tend to be fairly conservative. So certainly there's some governments, Norway being one, which has funded a lot of work on controlling the arms trade, but is also fairly conservative at times. Second, a lot of governments aren't interested in funding this sort of work at all. So if you move out of Western Europe, it's very difficult to find any NGOs working on these issues who are government funded. So some other source of financing support for the civil society, I think, needs to be found. We need to understand a lot more about the trade and the consequences and the effect of arms transfers. At the moment, we know a bit about what's going where, but the actual consequences of the trade, what happens, as Øystein was saying, if arms are sent to Sudan, what happens to them next? What's the processes of diffusion? To what extent can we say that an arms transfer will lead to excess deaths or not? I mean this area is one in which it's extremely murky, and there's not a lot of research being done. And I think if we are to sort of feed into the advocacy agenda, we need to have a much better understanding of exactly what's happening and what the consequences are. And last, also, if we're bringing the government, we need government champions for this kind of agenda as well. I mean, ultimately, it's states who regulate the trade. It's states who decide what they're going to buy, what they're going to license. So without a sort of government champion, that would pretty much be impossible. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. I'll invite Andrew to share his immediate bless you, immediate reactions to the two Øystein and Nick's introductions. And while he does that, if you could raise your hands, and I'll note you on my list while he speaks.
Okay. I'm not sure if this is working or not. There we go. Okay. Can everybody hear me? Just a few comments. First, thanks to Øystein and to Nick for two great presentations. I think that on Africa and the role of African states, I think the point is extremely well made. What is also important to realize, though, is that this is in no ways unique to African states. That using the arms trade and flows of weapons, both licit and illicit, into neighboring states, even to groups within one's own state sometimes, has been a means of foreign and domestic policy for many decades and continues to be, and I would argue especially amongst the world's most powerful nations. And I would place the US at the forefront of that. I think, the Iran-Contra scandal, which is probably the most cynical and venal of all arms deals, was just one of many. And it astonishes me how even today the US continues to play this sort of role. For instance, I mentioned Joe de Hovsepian, the Lebanese-Armenian arms dealer. The Merrick's organization, of which he was part, was started by a former Nazi called Gerhard Mertens. Mertens' son, who was in the business with his father, is still very much in the arms business, operating from Virginia, a stone's throw from Washington, D.C., and de Hovsepian, who is still quite close to him, estimates that he gets about 85% of his business through the CIA. So I have no doubt that the US continues to use the flow of arms in a whole lot of ways to further foreign policy and other objectives. China, again, and the Chinese role in Africa is extremely important in terms of making weapons available both to state and non-state actors. For not huge amounts of money, which gives a whole new dimension to it. And I'm going to start to answer your question, but then move on to Nick's, because I think they sort of allied into each other in some way. What can be done in addition to existing regulation? I think Nick in part answered that by saying that, first of all, we've actually got to become more cognizant of existing regulation and actually implement it properly. And, the EU common position is often presented as the sort of template. And I think the EU common position, which is probably the best regulation or multilateral agreement that we have, is rubbish, frankly. It doesn't include government-to-government sales. So it was irrelevant to the South African arms contracts. The implementation of the common position is woeful. I went to one of the countries that I expected to be at the forefront of quite rigorous implementation, to Sweden, where Saab has been involved in all sorts of awful activities, including after 10 years of denial in November last year, after a series of questions from a prosecutor in Sweden. Saab undertook an internal investigation, and shock and amazement, they discovered that in fact 24 million kroner had been paid to the political advisor to the South African defense minister at the time of the South African arms deal. But they blamed that on BAE, even though it was done through a 100% owned subsidiary of Saab in South Africa. And the reason they blamed BAE is because they know the chances of BAE facing meaningful justice in the UK are probably less than President Jacob Zuma in South Africa actually facing justice for the 783 counts of corruption, fraud, and racketeering that were dropped 10 days before he was elected president by a prosecutor who was then made a High Court judge. And I met with the head of the Swedish enforcement agency, and fortunately there were various other peace activists in the meeting with me, because otherwise I would have assumed that I actually misheard him. But I asked him two things, just to reflect on the implementation of the common position. The first, Article 8 of the position, relates to socio-economic development, that any arms deals, any arms transfers shouldn't have a deleterious impact on socio-economic development in the buying country. So I said to him, well, what about this? It doesn't really seem to be applied by anyone. So he said, well, Article 8 is really difficult and complex, so we just ignore it. And this is Sweden. And then I said to him, so let's take an example of a large Swedish arms company that is shown to have paid bribes in a country that it's selling to. Would that make it more difficult for them to receive an export license for a subsequent deal? And this is the guy who is supposed to act as the sort of watchdog over arms exports. And he looked at me with great sympathy, as though I was immensely stupid, which I might well be. And he said, well, of course not. He said, we don't know what sort of justice systems these countries have. We don't know whether, what they regard as corruption accords with our understanding of corruption. He said, so, we can't really let that be a factor. And when we got out of the meeting, and I just read through my notes with some of the activists I was with to ensure that I hadn't misheard this guy, they said to me, but why are you surprised? This guy was put in his position after serving 19 years as an executive in one of Sweden's big arms companies, and is also a local politician for the Conservative Party. And it was from the point that he was appointed that we realized, the activists were saying, that the oversight role of this body in Sweden is just gone. So, and again, if one looks at the United Kingdom, and even more so Germany today, where, if we just take the example of one German company, Ferrostal, which has been investigated, was investigated in terms of the South African deal, and prosecutors found that there was absolutely nothing wrong. We managed to get access to an internal report that Ferrostal had commissioned from a group of American lawyers, because they were facing so many investigations around the world. They wanted to get a sense of what they had and hadn't done. And the lawyers in this internal report confirmed that they'd paid $40 million of bribes on the South African deal. German prosecutors had no interest in reopening the case. Another German company paid bribes and applied for a tax rebate on those bribes. The German law changed the year before they made this application. They eventually reached a settlement with the German tax authorities in which they paid a fine. Absolutely no mention was made of the bribes, even though we had material evidence. We had minutes of a series of executive meetings. First, a meeting in which they had sat with the head of procurement in the Defense Force, who was asking for the bribe, in which they heard his request. A second executive meeting in which they agreed that they would pay the bribe. A third meeting in which they confirmed that they had paid the bribe to a financial shell company in Liberia at the time. So I'm really concerned even about the best case example of multilateral regulation that we have. But I think the enforcement of existing regulations is the first starting point. The second, I agree with you entirely. Significant socio-political change is desperately needed, and significant political change, institutional political change, not just in Africa, but I would argue in some of what are described as the world's more advanced economies and democracies. I would like to add one other element to the very important point that Nick made about civil society and the role of civil society, which I think is incredibly important. I think the Control Arms Coalition, for instance, around the ATT, has done some incredible work and has actually made the ATT far more of a focus for activism than it otherwise would have been. I, however, must admit that I am incredibly pessimistic about the prospects for a meaningful ATT. I think it's going to be an incredibly weak treaty, and I think as a consequence of that, all it will effectively do is give a stamp of approval to the status quo as it exists. But I do think there's another element that is related to the civil society dimension that you mentioned, and that is the need for active citizenship. Because we must not forget that a lot of these transactions take place not only in our names as the citizens of the countries buying and selling, but also with our money. This is taxpayer money that goes in to massively subsidize these industries and to massively subsidize some of these deals. And I think that we're at a political moment globally where, as a consequence of the Arab Spring and to some extent the Occupy movements, people are starting to say, well, we can see how our political systems are benefiting a very small elite, but are they actually doing anything constructive for us, for the vast majority of people who pay the vast majority of taxes? And I think, the notion, and I know it's a little bit cliched, but the notion of active citizenship is extremely important on this issue. There used to be an incredibly strong anti-war movement. I think got subsumed by the activism around nuclear weapons, understandably. But I think there is a need to, in a sense, reignite an anti-arms trade movement that was perhaps best led by Woodrow Wilson and Lloyd George, both who spoke about the awfulness of war profiteering, especially during the First World War. So I think that notion of exposing, revealing, and ordinary voters withholding support from representatives who are supportive of their government's activities in the arms trade is very, very important. Just very quickly to carry on with a couple of the points that Nick made, I want to add two things. The first is that there's some very interesting work being done by a legal professor at the University of British Columbia in Canada, a chap called James Stewart, on the use of international law, international criminal law, against both individuals and arms companies, for transfers where those individuals or companies should have or probably did know the use to which those weapons were going to be put. And I think, and we're looking at the moment, he has a sort of a steering group of people, and we're looking for an appropriate case study at the moment to use as to see whether this sort of course of action will be successful. And I think that sort of action would have a galvanizing impact both on any sort of campaign movement, but also on the way in which the companies and governments themselves behave. So that's another area that I think can be looked at. Then in terms of the US, I think it was extremely interesting that you used Jimmy Carter for two reasons. First, obviously, Carter was replaced by Ronald Reagan, and it was at that point that defense spending started spiraling. And one of the reasons that so much of what happened in the Iran-Contra scandal, with the help and involvement of Israel, it's important to state. And the other thing that I wanted to add to what you had said is that it astonishes me how many Israeli arms dealers there are on the continent of Africa. And I just could not figure this out until I spent some time in Israel and discovered that up to 4 years ago, when you retired as an officer in the IDF, you were almost automatically given a permit to trade in Israeli weapons. And so for a lot of people who'd spent their entire lives in the military, the obvious thing to do was just to head to wherever there was a conflict and to make a lot of money out of one or two arms deals. And that's exactly what's been happening. But sorry, to come back to Reagan, defense spending spiraled with Reagan. The role of the defense contractors, I think, took on or moved to a completely different level under Reagan, and it's never looked back. Certainly, Clinton made absolutely no difference. We know what the two Bushes did, and especially Bush Jr. And very sadly, Barack Obama has largely just continued that at a whole range of levels. I also think that the discourse in the US has become so much more difficult post 9/11. And the way in which the US perceives the world. So that if one looked, for instance, at the decline in State Department budgets at the same time as the Pentagon budgets have been increasing, I think that tells you a story about the way in which the United States sees itself solving issues around the world, not through diplomacy, but through military might, which has a whole economic benefit in and of itself. I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, so we'll turn to Q&As. The first question is the gentleman at the second row. And if you can please state your name and affiliation and speak up into the microphone so we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Pio Ding. I'm not interested in arm deals, but I'm interested in stopping the trade. I'm with Norwegian Church Aid. And my question kind of slightly was answered by Andrew. But thank you all, by the way, distinguished gentlemen, for the good presentation. My question is this is a very cynical trade, as you said, and I'm still very cynical. It has not faded my cynicism. But what I'm seeing now is that countries, to curtail these regulations that are coming, they're moving into, for example, countries like in Africa, like China is moving and producing the weapons in Africa. Like now, Sudan produces a lot of light and small weapons and to medium range heavy weapons. And this and as you already, you gentlemen have said, the trade is very murky. And now you're going to Africa where it's opaque. There is nothing. You can't see anything. And the weapons, maybe I was just thinking, how can we mitigate this? Maybe the answer was lying somewhere where Andrew said with these new international laws or how these weapons will be used. But I'm afraid you'll go into your old age still. Yeah. And my other question is, you mentioned champion countries or champion governments. So could you give an example? I just want to have some. I still want to keep the faith here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to take two questions at a time. Two questions because time is running so quickly. The next one is Ola Thunander.
Yeah, my name is Ola Thunander from PRIO. First to the government champion, Olof Palme was some kind of this. He told a friend of mine that he went into peace demonstrations during the day and selling weapons during the night. So and of course when he was selling to India, they have a big deal, I think 20 billion crowns. Yeah. I think deal, something like that. A friend of mine in the defense ministry argued that the bribe was 17% originally, and he got it down to 7%. But he offered something that Gandhi couldn't resist, so to speak. That we could speak about later. Yeah. But I think in these cases that I don't know what if 17% or 7% is a usual bribe sum, so to speak. But in the case of the South Africa deal, I think it was clear that on the one hand you have the Wallenberg family who owned the Saab, who had very close ties to the white regime in South Africa, and were very much in conflict with Olof Palme and the Social Democrats. And it was, you could easily be killed in these kind of days. Yeah. And also the man who was responsible, who was in the agency, enforcement agency, so to speak, at that time disappeared in front of a subway train. Yeah. And he had been the former chief of intelligence, actually. Yeah. So it is a very difficult area, but in this case, in the South Africa case, Sweden has both sides. Sweden had the ANC through the Social Democrats, and Sweden had the white supremacist, or if you want, through the Wallenberg family. Yeah. So they have both sides, and then they have BAE to do the corruption, because I think that is the reason why they collaborate, because someone has to do the corruption, and then it's not so nice for Sweden to do that. So you have to have someone else to do it. Thank you. It was only one question.
Yeah. So the first question, I guess you'll perhaps have a comment to that.
I hope this is on. I'll just address something Andrew mentioned first. I mean, in terms of the EU common position being crap, I think, well, partly it's a sort of glass half full or half empty answer, in that certainly there's big problems with it, but I'd say it's better than the situation before we had one, because at least we now have some kind of standard to hold governments to, whereas previously that didn't exist. And also in terms of the implementation, I guess the government's commitments to its terms are, often it seems to me it's a bit like a husband who's committed to his wife but has an awful lot of affairs on the side. I think to a certain degree, arms transactions licenses are being refused on the basis of the code, but it isn't hard to find pretty egregious examples of arms transactions which have been allowed. One I was working on a few months ago, you had the demonstrations in Egypt. You had Mubarak was replaced by basically a military junta. This was last year. You then had in November pro-democracy demonstrations in Tahrir Square, in which about 32 people were killed. And guns were fired by the government at those demonstrations. Somebody managed to pick up some of the spent cases and the ammunition, photographed them, then sort of working with a few other people, worked out that it was produced in the Czech Republic and exported in the spring of 2011. So you had ammunition exports went to what's basically a military hunter in Egypt, in a region in which there was a war going on in Libya, war going on south in Sudan, and this was presumably a licensed export by the Czech Republic. It's absolutely very easy to find examples of where the EU common position certainly doesn't live up to its ideals. Also with the arms trade treaty, I mean again, my usual jaded cynicism sort of means that I'm inclined to agree with you there. However, I have to say that I've consistently been proved wrong in terms of its success so far. So, sort of back in the start, I was kind of advocating for it, but thinking now, well, if it does happen, it's going to take 40 years or something. So, I mean, you never know. I may be proved wrong again. If we move on to the questions, what to do about China, and especially China producing, setting up production in Africa. I mean, certainly it's, in terms of sub-Saharan Africa, China is clearly the largest arms supplier, except maybe if we exclude South Africa, but in terms of the sort of countries involved in, or neighboring armed conflict, China is the big supplier, and as was said earlier, they're not really selling the arms. They're being either given away as part as sweeteners in deals, or if they are being sold, from what we can see, they're being sold at prices that they aren't really making a profit from. So you have a whole string of resource extraction and infrastructure and arms sales packages. So Chinese companies get to extract resources, and in exchange they're building infrastructure. I mean, you go around Sub-Saharan Africa, you see, enormous brand new sports stadiums which have been built by, generous gift of the people of China. And arms as well are being used as a kind of sweetener. One of the frustrating things certainly with China is that you can see that, I mean, explicitly with several governments, that when you have these interfering Westerners are starting to talk about, well, human rights, and we don't want to sell arms to you because you've got a war, then they can just go to the Chinese, and the Chinese are a much more reliable partner. They aren't asking those questions, which is unsurprising, given the sort of state of human rights within China. So yeah, I agree. It is a very big problem. Setting up production in African countries is arguably an even greater problem, because once you have that production there, it tends to stay there. And also, to follow on from what Øystein was saying, I mean, when people have looked in places like the DR Congo, actually examined particularly ammunition, where it's come from, a lot of it's actually been produced in Africa rather than being imported. The only sort of glimmer of hope with China, I guess, is that I have noticed a change in its attitude, say, over the last 5 years or so. In that it seems to have become much more concerned about its international reputation. And that then is where, advocacy, where highlighting it can have an effect, and that China wants to be taken seriously as one of the major powers in the world. It then its international reputation is then more important to it. But again, when we're getting back to civil society advocacy, I mean, it may be hard enough to be an advocate in somewhere like South Africa. Try doing that in Beijing. So that's a big problem. I'll in terms of champion governments, I mean, if we look at the ATT process, for example, I mean, certainly some governments ran with it. You're looking at countries like the UK, for example. Again, the problem with champion governments, I mean, I think they're essential if you're going to have any kind of international agreement. It's governments who are going to organize that. But as I said, you've got to inherent conservatism when you do have these champion governments. But as I said, without them, I can't see a sort of international regimes being created.
Thank you, Nick. Could I just ask you to be a bit brief, because I have so many people on my list, so that we get through all.
Okay. Yep. I will try to be brief. Actually, I'm not sure if any of the questions were directed to me, so I will just try to add some more questions to the mix here, or kind of revisiting some of these points. But I'm very happy to see that both Nick and Andrew is providing some, to showing some of the things that can be done with some of these, or with the challenges of the arms trade, some of the possible instruments that can be enforced and some that are already in place. But I will come a little bit back to that, because there is some buts here, I think, that is important to be aware of. But first, I would like to ask a question to Andrew. Coming back to also my presentation, when we look at the entering of weapons into African war zones, would you say that it is the Stetson-hatted, shades-clad, khaki-suited kind of crook that we see on action movies that is the main problem when it comes to getting these weapons into the war zones? We were mentioning Israeli ex-officers. Or is it the very nicely clad African statesmen? Who are the main kind of, who should we target to avoid weapons entering these kind of conflict zones? And then to Nick about this with African states. You kind of remind me of an economist that is sitting, far away from the world. He has a can, and then he says, assuming we have a can opener, then we can eat this food. And that's the same with African borders and opportunities to export arms and not. I think the main, what I'm trying to get at is that the problem is with the current state of affairs in African politics. You said that if the African states were able to border their, or control their borders and to hinder the export if they had the raiders, but they don't have it. That's the problem. And it doesn't seem like they're going to have it in the foreseeable future. So what do we do then? That's my kind of cynical question to you. And then back again to what you said about China and other countries. I think when in your presentation we saw very clearly that it was, all the documentation you got was from the US. You had stacks of documentation, you had quite good access to the information. And that might be because there is actually a public domestic opinion that is demanding this. But we don't have this in Russia, we don't have this in China. And then we even see that in a country like the US, it's still possible for the politicians to use weapons as a way to forward their foreign policy, despite everything that you're saying. So I think I will kind of appeal to your cynicist side and try to give us some more realistic assessments. And that also goes to Andrew. I think, although Andrew is perhaps more on my cynical side, I don't know. So that will be my challenge to my two others as a non-expert on these issues.
Pow, here we go. Andrew, I'll give you 2 minutes because I want to give the floor some time.
No, I'll use this one very quickly. I think the issue of African countries producing weapons themselves is an important one. There was a whole lot of speculation that in June 2010, Iran actually set up a weapons factory in the Sudan. With the Sudanese government, there has been speculation over the last year or so that a Kalashnikov factory was to be built not in Africa but in Venezuela. So I think this is becoming something more of a trend, especially in small arms, of the weapons being produced in the regions in which they're being used. In terms of champion countries, I think the one country one has to look to is Costa Rica. The UK, Germany, the US, I am in the cynical camp when it comes to their roles in the ATT or anything else. I believe that the UK has perhaps the most corrupt arms industry of the world's major economies outside perhaps Russia and China. So what they're doing on the diplomatic stage and what they're doing in practice, and the support of prime ministers since Margaret Thatcher, both as salesperson in chief for the industry, but also to protect the industry from the legal consequences of some of its actions. I also do want to make the point that I actually think that cynicism is a very good default position. But at the same time, I also want to make the point that social movements can make a huge difference. And for those of you who have never heard of it, have a look on Google at the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa. This was a group around HIV and AIDS of ANC supporting people. It was predominantly African women living with HIV themselves who, after a campaign of 7 years, brought about a change in government policy on antiretrovirals through the strength of their commitment, the passion, and the cleverness of the way in which they used the ANC's own tools against the organization once it was in government. Also, it's important to remember what Margaret Mead, the not uncontroversial anthropologist, once said: "Never doubt that a group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has," which I think is very important. Very quickly on Sweden and Olof Palme, crucially, what happened in the Bofors deal was that Palme was told by Rajiv Gandhi that they were going for French weaponry unless he was prepared to move the Swedish agent to an Italian agent who was a close family friend of Sonia Gandhi's. And this guy, a guy called Quattrocini or something like that, I don't remember his exact name, it's in the book, had never been in the defense business before and was paid $158 million for doing absolutely nothing. And that was basically the way in which bribes were paid to the Gandhi family and to the Congress movement. And Palme agreed, and that's why Sweden got the bribe. It's also worth noting that Ferristal have a company in the UK that they set up with ThyssenKrupp called Marine Force International. And the only thing that MFI does is it helps other arms companies, besides Ferristal and ThyssenKrupp, to pay bribes on arms deals. Mainly, but not exclusively, through economic offsets. Anything else I wanted to say? Oh, just the final thing I'm going to comment on, the sort of the adventurer arms dealer in Africa, be it Israeli or Joe de Hovsepian or Victor Bout or whoever. I think that the two are inextricably twined with the African statesman. I think they need each other and they use each other. So I don't think one can say the problem is this or the problem is that. It's perhaps easier to focus on the statesman in some respects because you can try and take action against that if one looks at the campaigns against Equatorial Guinea, for instance. But I think that they, and most African leaders of that sort tend to have a sort of an arms dealer of choice.
All right, and we have 2 questions here.
Thank you very much. I'll put myself on the side. My name is Knut Gjelleseth. I come from the WARG network. I'm also active in the Norwegian Peace Association's Weapon Trade Group. I wanted to make a link between 2 last commenting conclusions that was made. One from Nick Marsh saying that we need government champions, and I believe that Andrew Feinstein said we need active citizens. These come in conjunction, I would say. But from the WARG network, we have been working extensively with our members, making them, do good campaigns, have high quality in their political campaigns. One problem is, obviously, it is hard when it comes to weapons to avoid a focus on the immediate victims. Taking pictures of, child soldiers with their Kalashnikovs roaming around, shooting at various, in unprotected civilians. And so it has, in my point of view, and I would like a comment on that, it has portrayed that weapons in Africa is Kalashnikovs sold at $40 at a Darfurian market or $200 in Nigeria, but still, it is, wackos shooting with free weapons. So it removes the element of influence from outside. It seems to be something that happens because they are crazy. And to the extent that you link it to something that happens on the weapon export industry, it becomes then to like petty quarrel done very lethal with Kalashnikovs.
Yeah.
But a major problem for our African continent is, as you have pointed out, with the ANC and the purchase of major equipment, is that this has a much more profound, well, not necessarily much more profound effect, but at least a very profound effect. And it does destabilize the whole state. So could we have some advice? How do we communicate this? This is very difficult. And I wouldn't say that it's wrong to focus on child soldiers with Kalashnikovs, but it is a problem that it is so easy to do that, and it's so hard to find good ways of communicating these huge arms deals and the devastating effect it has.
Yeah.
So we need some advice on that. And in particular, how can we transform that kind of information campaigns to making our government champions on this field? Thank you.
Thank you for an intriguing question. And then give it to the person sitting next to you.
Hi, my name is Tor Christian Birkeland. I'm the coordinator of the Norwegian Ecumenical Peace Platform. We're doing some work together with the World Council of Churches on the Arms Trade Treaty. And Mr. Feinstein mentioned that corruption should be part of the ATT, and it could make a difference. Would you mind expanding a little bit on that? Because corruption has so far not been a major part of our focus so far.
Sure.
Ambassador? No?
Sorry, my name is Regina. I'm with the South Sudan Embassy here. What I wanted to say is just a comment maybe about the ATT. I think it's very important to have an international standard agreement, which is very important to follow up. And for example, in countries, it's very important to have an internal legislation which are very strict. And when people are buying the weapon, they're supposed to show documentation. It's done, like you have said, what is the weapon going to be used, where is it going to end up, and that should be documented. And then there should be a follow-up afterward. How did the weapon end up? And the point of Øystein in regard to African countries, I think the most important point is try to bring peace and democracy in Africa. Why is it in Africa there's so much conflict? How did this conflict come about? Because people need democracy and they need peace. And people who are rebelling, they need development, they need justice, they need equality. I think the problem will be solved with bringing first democracy in Africa. For example, you talk about active citizenship, that's very important. And the role of women also in Africa, how to bring peace, to build peace in all aspects. Like resolution 1525 is very important to be implemented, to bring women. How can you bring women to negotiate and to help in rehabilitation? Is the women who take care of people who are injured, people who are affected by all the sale of this arm and the use of this arm in conflict situation, and all the civil society. If we have full democracy in Africa, the civil society will be more independent. They'll not rely on government. And then there should be accountability, and very strict internal constitution of the country should be stricter, and the regulation to follow up on how to buy arms. I think this is what can help in part.
Thank you. We'll just the high pace. Åshild?
Yes, I'm Åshild Kålås from PRIO, and I just wanted to not criticize or be very cynical, but that's it might seem like that, but to unpack a little bit of the arguments that especially Andrew and also Nick has made. And I was thinking about the value of the trade in arms that Nick had on his PowerPoint. And I'm not a defender of corruption, but what is actually the difference between corruption in the arms industry and corruption in the knitting and croquet industry? So, like, is it why is it worse in? If it turned out that the corruption was worse in other industry. You know, is it the corruption or is it something else? And how do we argue? I'm just trying to kind of refine the argument, really. And secondly, if we go to the next sort of argument, that when is it that buying weapons is more important than buying medicines in any country?
Yeah.
Because definitely it's very serious in the case that you mentioned, but where is it that we draw the line when we, if we're going to have a regulation? When is it better to have weapons than medicine? So there again, you have a kind of a problem to, or it would be very good to explain more exactly. And then thirdly, about the regulation, how is it that regulation has helped curb the narcotics trade and industry? Because there are some problems there too that a regulation might run into. So those were my 3 questions.
Can you take one more? The last one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The woman sitting behind you.
Hi. Ingeborg Moa from Norwegian People's Aid, and we're working at the moment on a report looking at Norwegian corporate and institutional links to the Israeli occupation. So my question is to you, Andrew. Can you say something about what is the most or the most important aspects to be aware of when it comes to Israel's role in this shadow world today?
A lot to go at. Who wants to start? Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. So, Knut, about how to portray, how to communicate it. Yeah, I absolutely share your disquiet, and certainly when you look at images used in campaigning or the cover of books on these issues, you almost always see a kind of scary-looking, say, about 18, 19-year-old African male or a child with a Kalashnikov. You'd hardly ever see, say, a European or North American soldier holding a gun. Hardly ever see a woman holding a gun on, say, the picture of a book, unless it's specifically a book about, women or gender or something. So. So I absolutely share your concerns there. I think, I've got a lot here, so perhaps we can talk about how to do it later. And to be honest, I don't think it's that easy, because when you're moving into the sort of the aggregate levels of the trade, you're talking about statistics, and statistics very quickly become very tedious. So, but certainly let's talk about, we can talk about that later. Try to hurry up here. With the comments on the need for peace and democracy, and I'll take Øystein's comments about, countries like Mozambique need to have more than one X-ray machine for the whole country for their customs service. First, I was saying I was looking at, change by the time I'm dead. So quite a lot could happen in the next 40 years. So I'll leave that as a proviso. And also, in terms of building up infrastructure, there are systems, procedures in place already, for example, within the UN Programme of Action, to provide training, equipment, etc., for African countries. The trouble is that they're not being used nearly enough. So the systems are there, but as I say, they're not being implemented enough. Also, the difference between, say, the arms trade and the cocaine trade, basically almost all the arms in the world in existence have been produced under government control. You have some very low-level craft production of firearms, but even then they can't compete with a factory. When you're looking at aircraft, ships, tanks, etc., these are all produced in factories which are controlled by government. So the situation there is very different from cocaine, where you're basically growing the raw material on a mountainside in Peru. So that provides a lot more opportunities for control. I mean, if you're looking at the arms trade, a much better analogy would say the trade in pharmaceuticals, which have been produced in laboratories. So there is illicit trafficking in pharmaceuticals that have been industrially produced, but as far as I know, this is much less than the trade in cocaine or heroin. If you're looking at why look at the arms trade, again, as Andrew mentioned, if you look at organizations like Transparency International, I mean, they're routinely saying that the arms trade is, I think maybe not the most corrupt industry. I think that's probably public works and construction, but there's also an awful lot of bribes going on, but certainly the second, third, I forget the exact numbers, but so you can point to it being far worse than other industries. And the question about, when is it necessary to buy, when is it more necessary to buy arms than medicine or food or provide education? I mean, I think that links to what I was saying earlier, in that, there's these kind of ethical issues, and certainly, if a country is facing invasion by say an authoritarian regime on its border, you can make a case that it should be allowed to defend itself, or if peoples are attempting to have sort of liberation from, say, a colonial regime, again, it's very difficult to kind of say, well, you shouldn't have arms. Although clearly, especially speaking of the Peace Research Institute and having had Gene Sharp here yesterday, non-violent means of resistance are obviously preferable. But these ethical problems, I think, are an area where there needs to be a lot more work. And one reason you don't have this implementation, and from what Andrew was saying about the sort of sustainable development criteria, is it is complicated for them. It is unclear exactly what the effects are. So I think a lot more work needs to be done on trying to work out these problems.
Thank you, Nick.
Okay.
Øystein, can I ask you to, and I'll finish with you, Andrew, and Øystein, can I ask you to pick, thank you very much for that. Andrew, we'll have two minutes to wrap up, so if you can just choose some of the questions,
Sure.
and perhaps you can answer the others afterwards.
I think in terms of, I think the issue of communication is an absolutely crucial one. And it's interesting that while there have been a couple of textbooks and a bit of academic writing, there hasn't been an accessible account of the global arms trade since 1979, when Anthony Sampson wrote a book called The Arms Bazaar. And the reason for that, I'm aware of 3 writers in the UK who have written books on the global arms trade, which when they presented to their publishers decided not to publish. So I think the first thing is it's very important to get the information out there, and hopefully the fact that Penguin, my global publishers, have supported the book will help a lot of other writers to get publishing deals. Then I think you've got to use a whole lot of other medium, particularly film, television, social media. Sorry, absolutely, yeah. And I mean, what I'm thinking of doing next quite seriously, both because I want to try this as light relief after a book with almost 3,000 footnotes, is to write a thriller set in the arms trade, which will attract a completely different set of readers to this book. But I think the most important thing is just engagement with people about what it costs them, what it costs ordinary people. And I do an enormous amount of work in South Africa with members of the ANC Youth League, who initially don't want to hear from me because they see me as a traitor to the ANC, or at best a dissident. But then you start talking to them about what some of their leaders made out of the arms deal and what impact corruption is having on the ANC government. And a few of them do get interested. And I think engagement with people at that level, how it hurts them in their pocket, is extremely important. Corruption in the ATT, maybe we can speak a bit afterwards. I had a meeting about this yesterday, in which I think it's absolutely crucial that we have anti-corruption measures in the ATT for all the reasons that we've spoken about. And it hasn't really been on the agenda because even the coalition feels that very few governments will go for it, which in turn says something about the arms trade and corruption. And I think outside of sort of natural resources and some construction and other areas of public procurement, the reason it's so important in the weapons trade is not only because the effect that the weapons trade has, not only because the extent of corruption in the trade, because of the secrecy of it, but also because of the role of government in both buying and selling countries in this trade that I think is extremely important. And I'm going to come back to that in my concluding sentence. Just in terms of Israel's role, I'm very happy to talk about that in more detail. The section in the book on Israel is called America's Shop Window, because that's effectively what the Israeli arms industry is. It does a number of things. It's very involved in research and development for the US government and for US defense contractors, but a huge number of American weapons and Israeli weaponry are battle-tested in the occupied territories and in Lebanon. And I went to arms fairs before they sort of got wind of me and stopped me. And the most interesting stand was always the Israeli stand, where they'd have these big IMAX screens. And they'd have people who basically could be selling second-hand cars. And you would have these generals in all their finery, and they'd come and sit in these big plush leather chairs, and there'd be these scenes that were taken from actual war scenarios. For instance, of, Israel's big thing at the moment is drones, of an Israeli drone picking up a suspect, following the suspect, and then destroying the suspect. And the salesman would be crouching next to the generals sitting in their chairs and explaining to them what was happening, and everybody would get so excited, and this is how they actually sell their weaponry. So I think Israel's role is very important, and then the role of Israeli middlemen and dealers. There is one middle woman who is the arms dealer of choice for the Obiang family in Equatorial Guinea, but most of them are men. But the final point I want to make, which comes back to why the arms trade, why focus on this, my starting position from my own experience is that I experienced 4 years of what the late Václav Havel would probably have described as the politics of the impossible, rather than the politics of the possible. When under Nelson Mandela, when we first became a democracy in South Africa, we did something incredibly stupid and absolutely wonderful, is where we actually governed in the national interest rather than in the party's interest. We took a whole lot of constitutional decisions that didn't actually help the ANC around federalism and various other things. And that was because of Mandela, and his generation of leaders had a very different view to the younger generation of leaders who were looking at their political careers for a much longer period of time. And those few years of experiencing what politics could actually be like also made me realize just how tawdry the state of global politics is. And that all that happened in South Africa is that South Africa is not a whole lot worse than anywhere else. The tragedy of South Africa is we adopted the global norms of politics so quickly and easily after our democracy. Not that we're any worse than anyone else. And I suppose that the arms industry for me is the most extreme version, because it is an extreme industry. It's not a normal industry. But it's the most extreme version of the way business, or corporatization as some will call it, has come to pollute politics, both nationally and globally. And I accept it is an extreme version. But I think it shows how money in politics and business in politics, and the incredibly close relationship between the two, have come to pollute both of them, both the way we are governed and, I would argue, the effective functioning of a properly regulated market mechanism. And so that, for me, is why this industry remains so important to focus on and to try and develop some sort of awareness of, and in effect, to put it back on the political agenda where it's been missing for decades and decades.
Thank you so much for those closing remarks. And I remind you that you can continue the discussion tomorrow at 3 o'clock at Parkteatret at the Human Rights, Human Wrong Film Festival. And you can also buy the book there, I'm told. Thank you so much for coming to today's seminar. Thank you for our distinguished panel. And I wish you a wonderful weekend.
Thank you very much.